Personal mean, I guess, individual. Autonomy. Autonomy means, in moral philosophy and political philosophy, self-determination. So self-determination or autonomy, that is, an individual has a right, politically as well as morally, to determine her own self as she finds fit. That's the liberal view. Or at least one interpretation of the liberal view. So here we need to actually make a very important distinction between, when we talk about self-determination, you can look at it factually, and you can look at it morally or politically. Now, it is a fact that, or at least we can claim that it is a fact, that every mature, rational individual can determine his or her own self to a certain extent. As a fact. That has nothing to do with liberalism. This is the basic meaning of freedom of choice. That's not what liberalism is. But when you say that it is the right of every individual to morally and politically determine her own self as he or she sees it fit, then you are talking about liberalism, or a version of liberalism. So when we say, when we talk about liberalism and autonomy as a basic concept of liberalism, we are talking about self-determination on a moral and political level, not just at the factual level. At the factual level, obviously the whole moral system of Islam is based on the idea of freedom of choice. So Islam has nothing against that. In fact, if you don't have a choice, if you're not free, then Islamic commandments don't even apply to you. That's why all Islamic teachings apply to action, not to mechanical reaction or physiological reaction or psychological reaction over which we have no control. So that's clear. But it's hard for people to keep that in mind when they are engaging in this discussion. So it's obvious, but it's a very important distinction between freedom as a fact and freedom as a value. Whole Islam is based on freedom as a fact. Whole Islamic law, Islamic system of values, Islamic social mores and Islamic social teaching and individual teachings are based on the fact of freedom. But what Islam rejects is that freedom is any value or any intrinsic value, at least. It's rather a trial. On the other hand, liberalism thinks that this is an intrinsic value. This is something which liberalism bases whole morality and polity on it. On the other hand, Islam says that you have a choice, and if you choose to surrender your freedom and subjugate your will to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's the way of life. So actually, Islam is actually rejecting self-determination at the level of morality and value. So in that sense, Islam is the exact opposite of liberalism. Now from there, let's go back to where we started. So when you say that Islam is all for personal autonomy, as long as it is within the limits of Sharia or Islamic law or Islamic morality, it is fine. Now, formally, you might be able to justify this view. But what I want to show you, or at least what I want to argue, is that a life based on the idea that you are a liberal, but within the limits of Islamic Sharia, it means that what you really believe in is not Islam. What you really believe is in liberalism. You might be able to justify it formally, but what you really, and liberalism is providing you the basic content. Islam is only providing limits, and these limits, if you keep living a liberal life at the individual and social level, these limits will become a burden for you in the long run. So in the long run, the limits put on liberalism are no limits, because if you dedicate yourself at the personal social level to the liberal idea of personal autonomy, then in the long run it will become, for an individual as well as society, more and more difficult to live an Islamic life, because Islamic life is based on the idea which is the exact opposite of the liberal worship for freedom. It is the idea of worship itself, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and the God of Ismail, and the God of all the prophets, Hebrew prophets. So that's the basic thing, and I want to explain this point a bit more, because it's a very, very important point, even though it's hard to understand it in the liberal environment in which we live. So when you say that Islam allows personal autonomy, within the limits of Islamic teachings, what are you doing is you are yourself, basic self is a liberal self. You are only putting some limits. But if you develop yourself as a liberal self, it will become more and more difficult as time goes on for you to even keep those limits. That's one thing. And second thing is, if your main self-perception is positive, is that you are an autonomous being, this is exact opposite of a main self-perception of a Muslim, which is abd, because abd is the one who rejects autonomy, not just put limits on his autonomy, but basically rejects autonomy and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wholeheartedly. In other words, the basic difference between the two ideas, that you are going for self-determination, your positive identity is that of liberal. The only thing is you're negatively you're putting some limits on it. It means you are an Islamic liberal in a sense. On the other hand, if you are a Muslim, your positive identity is worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is exact opposite of self-determination. What you are trying to do is transcending this evil self which wants to worship itself, and you are trying to develop yourself so that you find contentment and pleasure and ultimate peace in a self which totally surrenders to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and which sees its main identity as the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the first conception, where you are going for self-determination, but Islam just put limits, Islam is a negative concept. The positive concept is that of liberalism. In this, where you deny self-determination and go for worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wholeheartedly, Islam is the positive conception. And the limits which the world put it, you are trying to transcend those limits, which are the limits of nafs ammara, limits of desires, with which we have to deal throughout our life. Okay, so I think this is a very important concept. I think they still need to talk a bit more about it, but for today, inshallah, we'll stop here. I'll continue from here next time.